Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're talking about the movie Encanto and all the points it raises about mental health and family trauma and how that plays out in this beautiful, wonderful story. And I'm joined today by special guest Saren Bryan. Saren is a mental health expert and therapist, as well as a huge fan of this movie and all things Disney. So we're really excited to have that conversation. One quick note I'll say is that we will be spoiling things from this movie, but as you will know if you've seen the movie, but if you haven't, the movie gets into quite a lot of fairly intense issues of family trauma and how that plays out for different people. And so that's a topic we'll be discussing on this podcast. And so if that's a hard one for you and it's not the right time to listen, of course, always feel free to hit pause and come back later or listen to one of our other episodes. But if you've seen this movie and you want to talk about it, or just you want to hear our thoughts on the mental health questions that this movie brings up and how it addresses them in such beautiful ways, you'll get to hear all that in just one moment after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew, your host. As I said, I'm joined this week by special guest Saren Bryan. Saren's been a good friend of mine for a while, someone I have a lot of great conversations with about fan stuff, and I've wanted to get you on, but especially when I saw this, and there was just so much mental health and family trauma themes, something I know you know quite a lot about. I wanted to get you on, so I'm so glad to have you here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's good to be on. I'm glad that we finally were able to make it work.
Definitely. Well, let's just start by tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and kind of your connection to this movie especially.
Yeah, so I am a licensed master social worker in Athens, Georgia. I primarily work with people in like non-traditional relationships and also people who have a lot of family trauma, which is pretty much everyone that needs therapy. So watching Encanto, it was very obvious to me that the people who created it had a strong understanding of family trauma and generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And generational trauma is particularly interesting to me because it's sort of an emerging field of study.
Right.
And not that I can necessarily speak to this, but it's more common in like ethnic minorities. We see that a lot more in ethnic minorities. So I really appreciated seeing a movie based in Colombia that was so knowledgeable of generational trauma.
Definitely. And one thing I want to say from the beginning is both of us are white. I think one of the most important things to talk about with this movie is it as a representation of Colombia and on so many different levels, from the art, the food, the music, the representation of the violence, as I know many Colombian writers have talked about it in terms of the history that the characters are running away from. And neither you nor I is kind of equipped to have that conversation. And so we're not going to talk about that today, although it's obviously a big part of what we're kind of overlaying everything we're talking about. There's some great writings that I've been following that have really helped kind of give me some better perspectives on this that I'm going to link to as part of the show notes that I definitely recommend people check out. But the reason I wanted to talk about this today, and I've heard some of the people from the movie itself talk about this, as well as some of the authors who commented on it, is that, as you said, the specifics of the trauma and the specifics of so much of the movie are very much based in Colombia itself. Mm. The experiences are ones that so many people, I think, can relate to. You know, and I first heard about this movie because I'm plugged into a lot of mental health discussions, both kind of professional and semi-professional, but also just, you know, a lot of friends who share some of the same kind of experiences going, hey, let me, you know, post a funny meme. And all of a sudden, all the memes I saw were about this movie. And it was, you know, I don't need a therapist. I just watched this movie 1,000 times, which is not true, to be very clear. But like, I did hear the joke many times of like, I don't need to do input. I don't need to do intake. I just ask someone, which character do you most identify with? And now I know what your trauma is, you know?
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, you know, it seems fitting in some ways.
Sure.
So I think that's kind of where we wanted to start. And let me actually first start by asking you, what is family systems theory when it comes to therapy? Because I think that's obviously a big part of this, as well as connected that to generational family trauma. Can you, you know, this is not going to be a psych class,
sure.
We're going to do a podcast, but it's helpful to ground our conversation in those terms, I think. So tell us a little bit more about what those mean.
Yeah, so family systems theory, I will be as brief as possible, was created by Bowen. So you hear family systems therapy and Bowenian therapy used interchangeably. It's the same thing, really.
Who was Bowen?
So Bowen was a psychiatrist in the early 1900s. I believe he died in 1990, so he lived for a good while. Who created family systems theory because everything before that had been a what we call a medical model. So he
Mm-hmm.
wanted a more interpersonal model of understanding human behavior. And he said that you can't understand people in isolation, that everybody is part of a relational unit, whether they want to be or not. So not working to separate these two things, but to understand how people act in their environment is basically
I can see that.
what he was saying. Um, he talks a lot about triangles, which is a big thing, but I won't go into because it's not super relevant. Um, he also talked about, and this was a big deal for the time that he lived, he talked about the generational transmission of trauma, and that parents will either continue the same dysfunctional patterns that they had, or they'll overcorrect and create different dysfunctional patterns, opposing dysfunctional patterns.
Right.
And the way you work with that is by changing the system that is perpetuating the pattern, not necessarily changing the pattern itself.
Right. And so how do you see that playing out in this movie? And we're going to talk about that for like the next hour or so, but kind of on a very general level, like what is it about this movie that connects to that?
So what I see, and are we assuming that people have seen it?
Yeah, so we're assuming that people have seen the movie, so spoilers if you have not. It's not kind of a big surprise movie, though there are some big surprising moments, but I think it is a wonderful movie, one I definitely recommend seeing. The songs are very, like, catchy and I think really speak to a lot of people. So I definitely recommend, if you haven't seen it, hit pause, or if you just want to hear the conversation, we'll try and explain enough about what's going on to bring you along. But yeah, go ahead and spoil away.
Okay, sweet. So really what I see in terms of a family systems perspective is it's a matriarchal family, which I love. I'm so here for that. But the matriarch is very rigid. And that term rigid comes up a lot in Bowenian therapy. And that she is so like singularly possessed with keeping the miracle alive and keeping everything at this baseline level of functioning that she doesn't necessarily seem to care who she hurts or how she hurts people along the way.
Right.
Because she has sort of this, like, I want to do better for you than was done for me. I want you to have a better life than I had, which is a beautiful goal. But it ends up creating this dysfunctional pattern.
Right.
Where people are driven by this, like, sense of duty and sense of responsibility to her.
One thing I got out of it, and I have some mental health training as a former pastor, but nothing like what you do, and so tell me if I'm misunderstanding it. It feels like this is a great example of that kind of family trauma being passed down because, the grandmother is presented as a very harsh character, and I think in some ways kind of the sort of main antagonist in some way. But, she experienced this incredibly traumatic thing herself, of her and her family and all the people she knew were driven out of their home. They were refugees, and her husband was killed as part of that. And then it fell to her to kind of raise this, to protect this community, to raise her children. And now what she in some ways has never gotten a chance to process that trauma. And instead, so now what most of the movie is about is how each of the different characters are experiencing that trauma.
Yeah.
And one thing I thought was really interesting was, Disney movies are fairly formulaic, and this one kind of played with the formula in some ways. Like, it's kind of a princess movie, but it's the boy who talks to animals.
Yeah,
like,
I loved that.
That was a fun little thing. But one of the things is that often there is an antagonist of some kind. Even if it's something like, the movie Brave, where mostly it's a movie about a relationship, there's still the bear. There's the thing out there. In this, it felt like the villain, the antagonist, is this trauma.
Yeah.
And the victory over it is when they start to talk to each other, when they start to break out of their roles.
Yeah.
Do you think that's an accurate way of seeing this?
I think so, yes. The villain is the trauma and the hero is communication, which I love.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the topics that comes up all the time is the idea of seeing things and, people feeling unseen or unheard. And I think that's kind of it's never exactly stated like this, but it's pretty clear. Like Mirabelle's gift is that she sees things and that she's willing to put voice to them.
Yep.
And that once she starts speaking, it's kind of that avalanche of everyone else wants to speak up about it as well.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about first. Let's start with that kind of the trauma that she goes through, and I want to talk about kind of these general thoughts, and then get into each of the individual characters, or at least many of the individual characters. One of the things that really strikes me is that not only does Abuela wind up like having this feeling of wanting to protect the miracle and protect her family, but then this incredible responsibility that goes with it.
Yeah.
You know, and she starts saying like all the town believes in it, and she feels like she has to protect them. She says at one point that I have to earn the miracle. You know, and she's always teaching everyone else, it is your responsibility to look out for the family, to look out for the town. Talk about that. What's going on there?
Oh, I have so many thoughts about that. And that is a theme that comes up with my personal clients over and over and over. I always use the imagery of Atlas, and that like Atlas was attempting to carry the world on his shoulders, but if you think about the statue, he was stooped over. He could barely lift it, let alone do anything.
Right.
And that I use that imagery a lot to demonstrate the weight of taking on more responsibility than you can carry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that makes a lot of sense for the character of Abuela, and bringing it back around to family systems. That's sort of what I mean in the terms of overcorrecting.
Mm-hmm.
She is overcorrecting way to the other side and creating this system of like, we have to earn this. You know, this was a gift and we need to prove ourselves worthy of it, and we need to be aware of the responsibility that has been bestowed upon us to this town and this community. And all of that is true. But she takes it too far. And then I think about that song, what is it, Surface Pressure?
Mm-hmm.
Luisa's song, where she's talking about like, that is a heavy weight. And that weight that is sort of involuntarily bestowed upon the rest of the family is the trauma.
Yeah, and like Luisa in some ways I think is the most clearly obvious representation of that. You know, I think in her song, I may have watched that video 12 or 15 times right now. You know, we literally see her in that same pose of holding things up while she's stooped over.
I was really thinking about that as I was watching it. I was like, wow, it's my metaphor works.
Oh, yeah. But one of the things I think is great is that what we learn is that each of them is dealing with trauma in some way. It's just that it manifests in all these different ways. Mm-hmm. And going back to this idea of sort of where that trauma starts, one of the things that I was guessing was happening, I'm curious how you would see it, is that part of what Abuela is thinking here is control, you know, and that, you know, I know for myself as someone who's gone through a lot of trauma, like one of the hardest things is the idea like for a long time, I looked for a cause. I looked for a reason. And even towards like, you know, when I was really not in a mentally healthy space, like, you know, maybe it's because like God is angry at me and I'm being punished, or, you know, the universe hates me or something like that. And I know from talking to many others that those are kind of the tricks your brain will play on you. Or blaming someone else. You want to think that there's some reason for it. And so therefore, if you can have enough control, you can prevent it from happening again. Do you think that it's fair to say that that's kind of some of what Abuela is passing on here, is that we have to earn the miracle? Because what that means is that if we are good enough, the terrible thing, the trauma won't happen to us again. Yeah,
that is a super common root cause for why people create these sort of rigid structures for themselves. Mm-hmm. Because it means that you have control. It means that, like, at least in this environment, I know what's going to happen and I can control what does or does not happen.
Right.
And that often comes from, especially as children, experiencing trauma and experiencing violence and experiencing instability, is that overcorrection is rooted in, I need to have control over something.
Right. And I made a brief reference to what I called the violence, and I want to just say that that's there's a very great article, there's a very powerful article written by Jose Maria Luna, and it's in Polygon. It's called "Disney's Encanto Isn't Just About Representation; It's an Act of Defiance." And that article really informed a lot of my understanding, although some other great ones as well. I'm going to post a link to that. In that, the writer talks a lot about, the writer is Colombian and talks a lot about how, because Colombia has had a long history of various forms of violence but also of therefore refugee situations and things like that, that the writer was the one who used the term the violence, which I understand is used often in that community, but again, don't quote me on that, and that's why I'm using it there. But I think you're right. Like one of the most important things is how it's a very specific story about that, but it's also one that I think could be a stand-in for so many other kinds of this kind of family trauma that often is due to, can be due to economic problems, political problems, social problems, or just, individual tragedy of one kind or another. Going very far afield, but have you seen the TV show Haunting of Hill House?
Yeah, I love that show.
I that's another one where I feel like the same kind of thing can be applied, in that the trauma is supernatural and kind of like spooky, but to some extent, but that most of the show is really about how that trauma has been played out, generation to generation.
Yeah, that's one reason why I keep coming back to that show, is because it does. And to me, and this isn't about Hill House, but I'll just say one thing, and that, like, I love when horror especially represents mental health issues, because it's such an apt way to show the experience.
Yeah.
And it kind of leaves me with the question of, like, was it supernatural or was it just how it played out?
Yeah.
Anyway, that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, and kind of here we have a similar thing in that, like, the magic is actual literal magic because it's a Disney movie and we want that. But there's also an extent to which it's the metaphor for everything. Which, when we get to the ending of the movie, I have some thoughts on that we'll talk about. So I think kind of the next level of how this plays out is that everyone in the family now is defined by their gift. And like, I the first time I watched The Family Madrigal, the opening song, I was kind of like, okay, Disney, you've taken the, like, do we need exposition to a whole new level, and you've done it in a song, but you got things like the grandkid roundup. This is pure exposition. And it was great and fun and beautiful music, beautiful dancing, animated so well. But then when I watched it again, one thing I really noticed is every character is introduced solely by their gift. We don't know anything about Isabella except that she's this perfect princess who can make flowers. We don't know anything about Louisa except of how strong she is and the aunt who can control the weather. What was your kind of take on that, of, like, watching this family where they're all identified by this gift, and it is both what makes them special, but it's also what they can therefore give back to the family?
Yeah, I don't want to push it too far out into the rest of the story, but in my viewing of it, I thought it was very telling from the beginning of, like, okay, it goes back into that, like, idea of we've been given this gift and now we have to do everything we can to earn it, which is finding your soul identity and what you can give to others.
Right.
And it makes it, and we're not talking about Bruno yet, but it makes the character of Bruno particularly tragic to me, because this family only allows themselves to be defined by their gifts. When your gift doesn't serve in the way that everybody around you expects it to, you are utterly useless.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And one thing I was so struck by is that basically all three sisters on that side of the family, Maribel, Louisa, Isabel, all get to have the kind of Disney traditional I want song, and for each of them, it's about either the lack of gift or, with both Louisa and Isabella, their songs are primarily about how they're reacting to that. Louisa feels like she cannot possibly let the family down, so she has to be this, like, rock of strength. Isabella basically has the exact same issue. It just presents in a very different way, where she says, like, I have to be perfect for the family. I have to be the role model, even to the point of I will marry a person I don't want to marry for the family. And to me, that was something that really struck me as someone who's both experienced this in my own family and in others I've talked to and read about and encountered. That level of, like, once the trauma is starting to be passed down to generations, now you all have a feeling of like, I have to sacrifice to save everyone else.
Mm. Yeah, that martyrdom is a big theme in generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Sacrificing everything for the good of the group, even though it's not good for the group. It is in a
Right.
short-sighted way, in a temporary way, perhaps. But
Right.
yeah, I think you're very right there.
And I think the way what I took out of the way they played with that theme was this interesting thing of, you know, one of the hardest things about sacrificing is when you're sacrificing for someone else who hasn't asked for it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I often hear like these talks, you know, someone says like, well, for 20 years I've been making your sandwiches this way and with the crusts cut off because you want that. The other person goes, no, I love the crusts. You just didn't, you know, and they realize the breakdown of communication. Part of what I think is both so tragic but also so incredibly relatable about this family is that each of them thinks they're the only one who is dealing with this, you know, and like, you know, to me, the song with Isabella and Maribel especially is so beautiful, where Maribel, she can see that Luisa is suffering. She doesn't see Isabella is suffering, but she doesn't realize in some ways what Isabella is doing is the exact same thing as Luisa.
Yeah. That really gets into, to bring it back around to Bowen for a second, he's really big on birth order and the different expectations that are put on different siblings. And Isabella's the oldest, correct?
Yeah, I was wondering if that's where you're going. Like, Luisa, to me, very much has oldest daughter, oldest sibling syndrome, but she's not the oldest. She's the middle one.
Yeah. To me, it makes total sense to me. It's funny. Like, to me, Isabella is the oldest.
Mm-hmm.
She has oldest child syndrome written all over her. As far as that, like, especially eldest daughter, of those like expectations for perfection and expectations to be like the golden child, and eldest daughters are the martyrs. They're like, let me sacrifice myself for the good of my family, marrying someone, you know, all that kind of stuff. That's got eldest daughter written all over it. And Luisa has middle child written all over her to me, and that, like, let me silently do my duty and hope that it will be enough for people to notice me. Like, let me not complain, let me not make a nuisance of myself, but the weight of this responsibility is really heavy, and you're trying to get this recognition, baseline recognition even.
Right.
Which is its own difficult thing.
No, it's interesting because, yeah, I think, but I was talking to my partners, and when I pointed out, you know, Isabella is the oldest, we were all surprised because we all read Luisa as, I think that's often what people think of as eldest child syndrome. But you're right, it's once you realize that Isabella is making just as much of a sacrifice, just in a very different way.
Yeah.
In some ways, I love that we get to see each of them connect to Maribel, but I would really have loved to see more interaction between Luisa and Isabella themselves. Like, do those two resent each other in the same kind of ways? Because I imagine that sometimes they could see themselves as like, we're each doing our part, or they could see themselves as like, I'm making the sacrifice, but you get to have the fun life, because they don't see it in each other.
That you're hitting on something that I feel like is a deficit in general with this movie, and that I don't feel like I know any of the characters as like three-dimensional people.
Right.
And it's a kids movie, you know? I'm not expecting this like incredible character development arc.
Yeah.
But I would have really, for a movie that is so heavily focused on family, I really would have liked to see the family interact with each other more.
Yeah, I can see that. And that when we get to the end of the movie, I definitely have some strong feelings about how the grandmother situation gets resolved there. But yeah, I mean, I kind of feel this way about every movie now, but I kind of feel like this could have been a 10-episode, you know, Disney Netflix series that I don't know how those two worlds can go together, but maybe it's possible, you know? Like, where, yeah, you get so much more of each of these characters and how they relate to each other.
And I especially wanted to see how the, like, non-magical married-in spouses were, and we didn't get much of that at all, which is fine, but, like, there's got to be resentment there, right?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. Especially since it winds up being very gendered in that, you know, the one male child of that second generation of Abuela's children, Bruno, is gone. So it's only the two men who've married in. which I don't know if anyone else had this moment, but they're introduced in the song as these two men fell in love, with the next line being with the family, by which they mean that each of them fell in love with a member of the family. But at first I was like, we have a gay couple? We have a gay couple
I was
in Encanto?
excited for a second. I was like, yeah.
Right? And there are definitely some queer themes of coding that we'll get to in a bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, what do you see as what would you have wanted to see their role be more of? Because I think that's a very interesting thing. Is like, what is it like when you're the one who marries into a family that has this trauma, but you didn't necessarily grow up with it, but now it's your family and now it's yours.
Yeah, there's as a person who has done that, has married into a family that has its own set of deep, long issues, there is both a sense of being perpetually outside from it, but being pulled inside whether you want to be or not. And that, like, this is affecting your partner, which is affecting you.
Right.
But there's a sense of, like, you can never really understand. You can never really, because you didn't live it.
Right.
But at the same time, the longer you are in that family and the more integrated you become in that system, it does start to become your trauma as well.
Right.
So there's this weird, like, push and pull between, like, this was not my childhood and this was not my history, but now it is my life. So I am both part of it and not. I'm both inside of it and outside of it.
Yeah. And I like that, even though it's very brief, they do give you two different reactions to it.
Yes.
In that Felix, the uncle, Mirabel's uncle, he has embraced it. It's his story as much as anyone's. Yeah. And to the point where, like, his wife has to keep saying, like, is this my story to tell or yours, when they're talking about why we don't talk about Bruno. And I think my favorite number in the whole movie. Whereas Augustine, I'm not pronouncing his, Augustine, forgive me, I'm not pronouncing his names right, I'm sure. Mirabel's father, he's very much more hands off, and he even to the point of telling her, like, you get the sense that he's just as worried that he's going to break the magic, so that when Mirabel has the same concern, he's the one saying to her, don't tell anyone, everything's fine, let's act like everything's fine. Until later, when things really break down, and he, I thought, very in a great moment, is the one to stand up to Abuela, and she says, why weren't you thinking about my family? And he says, I was thinking about my daughter. And so do you see those two reactions as kind of at least somewhat typical, in terms of the one person who's kind of just trying to dive into as much as they can, and the other person is trying to be kind of like as hands off and like, this is fragile, I don't want to make a misstep?
There is no such thing as typical, really, with families.
Yeah, that's fair.
I can definitely see that as a very reasonable way for something like this to play out. It's definitely not unheard of. Yeah. I have nothing else to say on that.
That's fine. So I think the next kind of big thing I want to get into is this idea of the repression, because it does seem like that one of the things that's the paradox of this whole movie is that the trauma is what has defined everything, but no one wants to talk about it. And then when two different people want to talk about it, first Bruno and then Mirabel, they're ostracized for it. What's going on there?
So much. So to me, it goes to the idea of, like, this is the status quo. This is the box that we have created. It is safe. It is known. It is controlled. And even if it is incredibly maladaptive, at least it's controlled. At least it's familiar.
Right.
So when anything tries to disrupt that, it is incredibly destabilizing for the entire system.
Right.
Even though it would be better, it does not feel like it would be better in the moment. So that whole idea of we don't talk about Bruno I see that play out all the time. Maybe in less severe ways, but maybe not, too.
Yeah.
And that, like, this person was threatening to the very foundation, and that idea of foundation comes in later, and I love that. Threatening to the foundation of our family, threatening to the foundation of our community. It symbolizes big, radical change, and we are not ready for that.
Yeah.
So we're just going to not talk about it.
I want to get so much into that whole idea of what he's pointing out and then what
Mm.
she's pointing out, but just on a larger scale, so much of what Abuela says, where she keeps saying like, "Why aren't you thinking of the family?" And I kind of love that's why where Mirabelle's father stands back and says, I was thinking about my daughter." It, to me, it speaks to what you said about the institution, the family
Mm.
itself, the system itself,
Mhm.
where Abuela is often when someone says, "I must protect my family," what they mean is each individual person. But here it's like the family has taken on a life of its own to the point where a member of the own family who doesn't fulfill that can get cut away.
Several members I think we've seen. Like,
Right.
Bruno is, you're out. Mirabelle
Yeah.
is kind of down that path too. And
Right.
things could have very easily played out the same way for her. And I love that you bring up the idea of the family as sort of its own institution,
Mm-hmm.
because that's something that comes up in family therapy. Of like, there's always one more client in the room than is
Mm.
physically in the room, and that client is the system.
Right.
So it goes back to this, like, Abuela's got the right idea, kind of,
Right.
but she's twisting it in this like traumatized way, and of course she is. Like, this is
Mm-hmm.
a natural human thing to do. But when you forget that the family is made of individuals, that's harmful.
Yeah. I think it's a really good way to put it. And so, with that idea of the repression, why is it that it's so destabilizing? What is it that makes a system like this both seem so powerful, but also it seems like so fragile, where like just naming some basic truths can be so destructive?
That's a good question. So, if you think of the system as sort of a self-perpetuating
Mm-hmm.
thing, it has its own rules, its own truths, and its own norms.
Right.
And it's functioning in this way that for the system works. Maybe not well, but
Mm-hmm.
all the cogs are in place, like, this is how things work, whatever. And I think of it as, especially for a family like this sort of like impermeable bubble.
Right.
So when a different truth is introduced, it's earth-shattering.
Yeah.
It's not dissimilar from deconstructing religion or questioning sort of like your own fundamental beliefs and truths
Oh yeah.
about the world. It's a similar process.
I mean, given how much each of these people has shaped their identity by their reaction to the trauma,
Yeah.
it's a challenge to that on a fundamental level. Like, who am I?
Yes.
I'm the strong one. I'm the perfect one.
Yes.
I'm the, and one thing I was really hit by in terms of that, it kind of going back to what you were saying about how if you marry in, on some level you didn't experience the trauma. I think one thing this movie gets so well is that, and I think something like Hill House did as well, there isn't one trauma that everybody experiences in the same way at the same time. Like, trauma's kind of postmodern,
Yeah.
and that like
Right.
it's this terrible thing happens and I have a trauma with it and my sibling has a trauma with it, my parents or my children have trauma with it. But those are all our own experiences, and the real conflict comes when there's like, I think I have this in my own family very much so, a sense of like, if your experience is different than mine, you must be invalidating my experience. Because again, like, I don't get to talk about my experience. I don't get validated. No one's going up to Louisa and saying, it is awesome that you do this thing. She's doing this all in silence. And so if Mirabelle or Isabella or someone else gets to have a different experience, like, that's challenging to her.
Yeah.
Or actually, especially Isabella, I think really goes through that.
Yes. I think of all of them, Isabella is the one that gets the brunt of that.
And so just going one step further, this is a term that gets tossed around a lot, and I know it's not intentional. And so, do you think that it's fair to say that like there's some gaslighting happening here in terms, especially like the grandmother to Mirabelle, but this whole just sense of like, we all have this idea that the house is perfect, the Encanto is perfect, the candle is great, the magic is great. We're not going to look at the problems. And so, yeah, when Bruno points things out, he's silenced, he's put away to the side. When Mirabelle points things out, she's kind of, again, shunned off to the side.
I really think it depends on how you define gaslighting.
Mm-hmm.
And for my personal definition, I tend to think of it as I am invalidating this person's reality and attempting to convince them of my reality.
Right.
So on some level, I would agree. But what makes it maybe less overt is that they're not, like, Abuela doesn't appear to be, to me, attempting to brainwash Mirabelle into being like, you believe that everything is okay or you're out. It's more of just like, be quiet about it. So it's like gaslighting light.
Yeah. It's very much the sweeping everything under the rug kind of reaction.
It's like Abuela knows that something's wrong. Everybody knows that something's wrong. It's just that we're not going to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of gaslighting and kind of not.
And is that why the ending becomes so powerful, where the way to defeat the enemy, to heal, is they begin to talk about it, and I think this idea that by Mirabelle, like, she says something to Louisa and it causes Louisa harm for her to have to think about it, but hopefully leads to healing. Whereas Isabella, like, they have this conflict and then they get to a better place and the magic does start to come back for a bit. And then I think at the very end, that's sort of the idea of bringing everything out into the open has started at least to bring healing.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that you said that it brought Louisa harm.
Mm.
What are you seeing as the harm that was done?
And I mean, the language there is very difficult because I think that it's kind of a very double-edged sword, because to me, Louisa goes through the Wile E. Coyote moment of, I can keep running until I look down and realize I'm not actually running on anything, and then I fall, and that Louisa has this very strong but very brittle, very fragile thing happening where once it is pointed out to her that, wait, you don't have to do all this, you don't have to be the strong one, and you need to talk about the fact that you're suffering a lot more than you think, all of a sudden she starts losing her strength. That's kind of where I was going. Like, harm, you're right, is the wrong word, but it's an interesting thing of, like, on a very basic level, you could say that, like, it looks like Louisa comes out worse from her conversation with Mirabelle.
It does. But I think that I would argue, at least from a mental health perspective, that just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean it's harmful.
Yeah.
And as we see, it ended up being the best thing that anyone could have done.
Right.
Was to bring it out. And that's sort of, I think, such a gorgeous representation of that destabilization that comes with a loss of identity, or a reframe in identity, even.
Yeah.
And
the destabilization word seems such a better way of saying it. Yeah, because it's that, like, the facade was helpful in its self-medicating is the wrong term, but it's that idea of, like, you're filling in a gap in this problematic way, but it's still, you're taking away the thing that's filling in the gap. So at first it's going to be very destabilized. That's
sort of why, like, working with addiction it's worse before it's better for a lot of people, because, like, a maladaptive coping mechanism is still a coping mechanism.
Right.
It still works. It's just hurting you in the long term. And I think that this example is a really, really cool representation of how that looks.
Mm. And so I want to talk about the kind of relationship among those three sisters, and maybe this is a good starting point, because it seems like Louisa and Isabella have very different reactions to the sort of breakthrough moments. Louisa, it's destabilizing and things start to fall apart for her, and she's clearly emotionally upset for a lot of the movie because of it. Isabella, it's the opposite. Like,
is it?
Well, I mean, that's what I'd ask, because it seems like she gets this moment of really getting to blossom. I mean, quite literally, and create her own new things and stuff like that. What do you see in terms of what Isabella goes through as opposed to Louisa?
It's so interesting because, like, to me, Louisa skipped a step. She went straight to that pain, which is awesome. Like, that's what I would hope for everybody, of just allowing yourself to sort of feel all those, like, vulnerable, uncomfortable, big emotions that come with this sort of destabilization. But Isabella, based on her own, how she has internalized this trauma to begin with, of, like, this perfect person, handled it very differently. but there was underneath all of that, there was pain.
Yeah.
And that had to come out. It just took her longer to get there.
Right.
And at first she was like super angry and super externalizing her blame onto that. She was like super upset with Mirabelle. She was super upset with everybody else for ruining the facade.
Right.
But anger is usually a secondary emotion that is popping up to protect us from more vulnerable emotions. And I think it did a pretty good job of showing that process of like she had to feel the anger and let that move through her so that she could feel the pain.
That makes sense, because I guess the way I was seeing it is kind of like drawing this metaphor further. You know, the song that they sing with Mirabelle is kind of their therapy session. You know, and in each one they make a confession. Louisa confesses that she's that this pressure is getting to her, the drip, drip, drip. So I think so many people relate so well to that song. And at the end of that, she's in a really hard place. Isabella, during this conversation, you know, during the song, confesses that she doesn't want this perfect life. She doesn't want to marry this guy. And at the end of it, she's able to use her power in ways that she never had. Yep. But you're right. It's, I think, because she had gone through the anger before that conversation with Mirabelle.
Yep. That was definitely how I was conceptualizing it.
Yeah. One of the things also that really struck me about that, and again here tying it into my own experience, the first time I watched it, I felt like I would 100% identify with Louisa. And then I kind of untapped that I still have some kind of like resentment in some ways towards my sibling, in terms of like feeling like the sacrifices that I made to hold up the family were never really acknowledged. And then thinking about it, especially after what happened when I moved away and went to college, and then I haven't had a chance to talk to her. I don't know if I will. We'll see. But like, I imagine my sister would probably look at Louisa in the same way, you know? And to me, it's kind of, it's to me, what that gets at is what I think this movie does such a great job of showing that I would imagine that each of these sisters, they each feel like they're having an experience that the others aren't, you know? And that I think it makes a lot of sense that probably in our own world, a lot of people could look at this and go, I was the Isabella in our family. And two other people go, no, I was the Isabella in the family, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is such, like, because you both are and you aren't. Like, your experience is your experience, and nobody can invalidate that. So maybe everybody really did feel like the Isabella.
Right.
But from the outside perspective, like, your perspective of your family and your siblings also matters. So if you're seeing more of Louisa and your sister, then that's just as valid. It's kind of like Schrodinger's family. Like, it both is and it isn't.
Yeah. Well, and that also kind of gets to what you were talking about, in that, on the one hand, it's brilliant that this movie can represent so many different reactions to trauma, but on the other hand, it's painting in very broad strokes.
Very broad.
And like, each character is literally like one line of the reaction to trauma. And when in actuality, like, the Louisa character would have so much more depth. Yeah. The Isabella character would have so much more depth. But instead, it's the one character responds to trauma by having to be the strong one. One character responds to, etc.
But also, what a lovely way to introduce this concept to children.
Yeah.
And on that perspective, I don't mind that it's broad strokes. Because my 5-year-old kid may get this concept early. And it may make sense to her in a way that is very buildable in the future.
Right.
So I have no problem with a Disney movie painting broad strokes about trauma.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And like, even where we're gonna get into the individual characters in a second, but I want to bring up the one thing that felt like an off note to me, but I think it's because it's a Disney movie, you kind of need this. It felt like one of the things that they really got at was the idea of the magic, the Encanto, the healing was probably very much what the grandmother needed, and thus the whole family needed, but now was getting in the way. You know, it was stopping them from moving forward. And a friend of mine wrote in and pointed out something I missed, which was that as long as the Encanto was there, Abuela could never go and visit the river, literally the grave where her husband, their grandfather, had died. And so she was kind of denied that element of closure and of healing. And so to me, there was a real power in the house is gone, the magic is gone. Now the townspeople are going to come and rebuild with you. which also dramatically flips the relationship there of you don't have to take care of them. And then at the end, the magic came back.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just so annoyed in that moment. 'Cause it felt like it was undoing everything the movie had said. And the more I think about it, the movie, it's Disney and the house is really fun and you want to enchant it and you want to have the great animations and you want to sell some more toys of the house.
Yeah.
So of course, but what did you feel of that moment of the magic coming back?
I was so irritated is the right
Okay.
word.
Glad I'm not the only
We
one.
were very much on the same page with that. I was like, wasn't the whole point to realize that this magic is kind of getting in the way more than it is helping, and that you
Right.
can grow as a family and you can grow as a community without the assistance of this magic, that we're going to start like rebuilding our identities as people rather than just our gifts. And I was so happy about that. And then it was like, you blew it.
Yeah.
You blew it, Disney.
Well, not the perfect movie, but still pretty darn
No,
good.
it was great. I really did love it. And I mean, despite my irritation, I was like sobbing through the credits, so
Oh yeah.
it's fine.
too.
But
Like I said, I put together a little therapy playlist because
yeah,
to me it's Luisa and Bruno, but I think so many of these characters speak to so many folks.
I had a moment while I was watching this movie. I was like, I do not like that Bruno is the character that I am identifying with the most.
Yeah.
That feels
Well-
not great.
Well, let's start there because I want to talk about like individual characters. What is it about Bruno that you really connected with?
Oh gosh. There's a line that he says that when he's talking to Mirabelle, saying, "My gifts didn't help the family, so they just
Right.
pushed me aside." And that line really resonated with me as someone who professionally does something that my family does not agree with on like a moral or ethical or spiritual level.
Mm,
So it's their pride ran out in many ways. So it's
Yeah.
like you could argue that Bruno is really providing like a good service if people would see it for what it is.
mhm.
But because it's like this kind of taboo niche, kind of, he says like, "I'm not creepy. Why do people think I'm creepy?"
Right.
He's really
Yeah.
like ostracized, and I felt that.
There's a very like don't shoot the messenger thing,
Yeah.
you know, like, and especially even with the townspeople, like he didn't cause the goldfish
No.
to die, you know, it died. He didn't cause someone to get fat.
Right.
Like, he's just pointing out, but it's that like people don't want to think about the consequences of their actions or think about the fact that random chance might come
Yeah.
to them.
And I felt that too as a therapist. Of it's part
Mm.
of my job to point out difficult truths to people.
Yeah.
And it's so frustrating when a client quits or stops coming after a difficult truth has been pointed out, because it's like, you asked for this. You're
Yeah.
paying for this. And I felt that for Bruno, of like, they asked him and then shunned him when they got the answer.
Yeah.
That sucks.
And it's so funny too because with all that, I actually also related to the story, and this is maybe a more superficial level, but it also really hit me hard, which is the degree to which when someone in a family is mentally ill, you don't talk about it. I know I definitely went through a lot of mental illness and a lot of trauma with the family, and now there's kind of a sense, like with a lot of my extended family, there's a tension of like, well, I'm back, but we're never going to talk about what happened. We're never going to, and certainly heard from others, like when I was estranged from the family, you know, didn't get talked about. You know, I've heard many others talk about that. But at some later point, I realized that there had been another member of my family, a generation or two back, who had a lot of the same mental issues that I have. And it had manifested in the same way of like that she was pointing out things in the family that no one liked. I just knew that my cousin like didn't want to talk to people, and so we never spoke about her, and we were never supposed to ask about her, and we were never. And it broke my heart when I realized, like, if I had known someone else in the family, maybe because of my genetics or maybe because of, you know, similar situations, had some of the same mental struggles I did, like how healing that would have been. But because you never talk about it, like that whole song just felt like such a great description of the shame that so often goes along with mental illness and thus the silencing of it.
Yeah. Beautifully put.
So who's the next character you want to jump into?
Let's see.
Let's talk about Abuela.
Yeah.
Because I think it's easy to see her as the villain. And as you said, she's the one who has dealt with all this trauma and is now taking it out on everyone in some really harsh ways, and she's causing a lot of toxicity. And I kind of feel like you get to the end of the movie, and on the one hand, you could say the movie wants to forgive her and say, well, she went through all this trauma, so everything is okay. We're all sorry. I know a lot of people who are like, no, she's toxic and terrible. Let the whole family move on without her. What? I'm guessing you don't see it as one of those two poles.
No, I don't. One thing I love about Abuela as a character is it's very gray. She's a very gray antagonist, and that we have an explanation as to why her behavior is what it is, but a phrase that I say over and over to people is it's an explanation but not an excuse.
Yeah.
And that, like, we can completely understand why she has overcorrected and made the system as rigid as she has. It makes sense. It doesn't excuse the harm that was done.
Right.
But the sense that I got is that Abuela is willing to move out of that rigidity.
Yeah.
And so there is forgiveness to be had there, I think. It doesn't mean that she should be shunned in the way Bruno was shunned.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a solution. There can be boundaries. That's not the same thing as boundaries. And I do think that whole family could really benefit from boundaries.
Yeah.
But I think
maybe not all living under the same roof.
Maybe get your own houses. Whatever. That's not what we're talking about. But I do think it's a lot more nuanced than saying, like, she's toxic, cut her out.
Right.
Or saying, like, oh, you're forgiven, like, everything's fine now. There's a lot to be had in between.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think, again, this is the limitations of a single movie. I feel like the movie ends not with forgiveness. Like, what it should end with is not forgiveness, but of, like, we are now going to begin the process of moving towards that, you know? And, again, you can't tie that up with a nice little bow. You've seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, right?
Oh, yeah.
One of the reasons, and I hear a lot of people talk about this, that I love that story so much is that Zuko has suffered an incredible amount of tragedy and then turns incredibly toxic and does so much harm. Yeah, I mean, I think every therapist loves his story so much.
I love his arc!
He then realizes the harm he's done. Yeah. He wants to change, and he shows up and says, hello, Zuko here. And it's not immediate. It then takes another full season of healing and of time and of rebuilding trust. And I think part of why I love that story so much, She-Ra does a similar thing, is that it's the opposite of what happens here. We're here, and again, I get it why, because it's a movie, but the idea is we've had one breakthrough conversation, now everything's great, everything's fine. And I'm sure you've dealt this with clients. I know I've dealt with it myself a lot when I'm talking to a friend, and it's like, they're like, oh yeah, I figured it all out, everything's better now. No, you identified the problem. There's still a lot of work to do.
And identifying the problem is a huge step. Like, that shouldn't be discounted.
Right.
But that is step 1. Step 0, really. Of, like, okay, you've identified that there is a problem, which is good. But that is 0% of the work.
Right. For sure. Let's talk about Mirabelle, because it's funny that she's the central character, and I think there's so much growth to her, but in some ways she's kind of also she's the therapist. She's the one who everyone else has their therapy moment by talking to her, which is also another role in the family of, like, my pain doesn't matter, I'm here to help everyone else with their pain. What do you see in her character?
Mirabelle, for some reason, is a hard character for me to talk to. Or talk about, not talk to. Because I didn't feel like there was a lot to her. She seemed sort of like this is not going to be popular. She felt sort of like a plot device to me. And that everybody else is using her presence and her gift, we'll say, to get to their own kind of self-actualization. And she's just kind of along for the ride. Like, she was the catalyst for it, and that she saw the cracks in the house and she brought everybody's attention to it. But beyond that, she sort of had this sense to me of she's she's pulling everybody along on their journeys and not so much her own.
Yeah.
But again, unpopular opinion, and I did like her character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I get some of that. Like, I do think there's something. I think we get a lot of her character in terms of like the person who, like I said, kind of feels like it's their job to take care of everyone else, but also just the sense of like everyone else is more special than me.
Yeah.
And like, the if you're in a family where people are very creative and you're not the creative one, or very athletic and not the athletic one. But I think the first half of the movie is very much about her character growth. But then, yeah, she becomes more of the, and maybe this is the part because she's supposed to be the one who everyone, especially young kids, young girls, young kids of all generations, can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
That therefore she's kind of supposed to be a little bit more the blank slate. But remember, we get to the end of the movie, and the first thing my partner Mary says was, "Wait a minute, but did Mirabelle get her own room yet?" Because like she gets the doorknob, so I think she does, but it's the doorknob to the front house. Is she still living in the nursery? Does she get her own magic room? And I remember thinking as I was watching it again last night, they kind of talk about the candle as though the candle has a plan, and that like Maribel's gift is that by not giving her the gift, she's the one who can see everything. And so she's like, she gives so much to the family by exposing these cracks and talking about them. So does that mean the candle thought we're going to have this kid go through 8-10 incredibly traumatic years of not thinking she's special so that's kind of crummy?
It kind of sucks. Like I really do not love the idea. I don't love that it's ambiguous of did she get her own room? Like if we're going to bring the magic back, which we've already discussed is kind of a miss. Did she at least get like a cool gift room?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, and that is it sort of reeks of like Harry Potter syndrome to me, of like, we're going to put all of the responsibility of this on a child.
Yeah.
But not tell them how to do it. And just sort of be like, figure it out, kid.
And I do love that moment where she has the very Disney princess moment of like, I will go save things. And she's about to go do the Disney princess thing. And then immediately goes, wait, I don't know how to do this.
Yeah. I did love that.
The toucan, it was actually announced that the toucan was being voiced by Alan Tudyk, which I think was kind of intentional to make us think the toucan was going to become her talking pal. Nope. Flies away immediately. The one thing I really loved that they did with her later is, because again, it's subverting such an important trope. Bruno's first interpretation of the vision is, you have to go embrace Isabella.
Yeah. You
have to, and like, to some extent, it's true of you have to make a connection with Isabella so that Isabella can connect with you and name her own trauma, because she's not the awful person you think she is. But also kind of like, Abuela, knowing what Isabella was doing doesn't justify it, like you said, it explains, it doesn't excuse the way she's been treating Mirabelle. And I remember at first thinking, is Disney really telling us that you have to go hug your bully to make them better? I don't like that. And I love that instead it's that they don't hug. It's when Isabella says you have to apologize and Mirabelle eventually can't. That's when the breakthrough happened. Yeah. And I was like, okay, that's a good way of subverting this idea of go love your bully until they love you back.
Yeah. It's so funny that you bring that up. I was texting a friend while I was watching the movie for the first time. I was like, are you telling me that she's going to have to go hug her sister when her sister is the one who needs to apologize?
Yeah.
And my friend was like, just watch. And I was like, okay, but...
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I like the way it was handled. There's something in me that it's like a tickle of like, I don't love that sort of the catalyst responsibility was all on Mirabelle.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I mean of like, it shouldn't have been Mirabelle's responsibility to let all of these people know that they did bad.
Yeah.
And it's a movie. The plot has to move forward somehow.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to sit and watch a recreation of like a family therapy session.
I mean, I do, but
Well,
I also want
so
to
do
watch
I.
Tony and Cap sit and have a bureaucratic discussion about how to handle the Sokovia Accord. So,
Same.
what we want is not what everybody else wants.
Right. So, but just from a personal perspective, I was like, this family needs more self awareness.
Yeah. And I think that can often be the truth. I don't, this is one of the, I think the Disney writers knew this, even if maybe I wish they'd made it a little more explicit. It's a dynamic I know that can happen many times, is that when one person in the family cracks and becomes sort of the central point of, like when one person in the family like has a breakdown and becomes kind of the center point, like one thing that can sometimes be said is like, oh, it's so good that, we're so lucky to have had you, and like this trauma made you stronger and let you heal all of us. And it's like, no, don't try to justify the trauma you put someone through because now it gives them, like, Mirabelle doesn't have this because she had trauma. She's also a very insightful person who's brave enough to give voice to what she's insightful of. But don't make this as a justification of the way everybody treated her.
And I felt like all individual members of the family owed Mirabelle a bigger apology than she got.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted there to be more fanfare around that.
Yeah.
But maybe that's my own projection coming in.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, certainly what I would have loved to see a lot more of is the conflict between Abuela and Mirabelle's parents. Because, Mirabelle's parents, they at least seem to understand how hard this was to her. And like her mother goes to her and says, like, I know that Antonio's, gift ceremony is going to be hard for you. And her father eventually stands up for her and all this stuff. And I would have loved to see more of that. But again, 90 minutes of a Disney movie.
I do. That is one thing we were talking about, the like non-magical family members. Mm-hmm. I do also think it was a little bit of a miss for Mirabelle's father not to be more of a like very special relationship, and that like if anyone gets what she is going through, it should be him.
Yeah.
And the fact that he was even hesitant to stand up for her and was siding with the big F family, that was odd to me. Because it really seemed like no one was on Mirabelle's team, and if anyone should have been, it should have been her dad.
I think it felt odd to me, but it also felt very believable. Because it felt like he is afraid of being the standout one. And so in some way, there's an old thing, not an old thing, but there's a thing I know that gets talked about a lot in mental health, but also just, in casual conversation about, like, if someone wanted to do something, but they were afraid to, when they see someone else do it, there's often a need to tear that person down, like, well, I'm not allowed to act out in these ways, so you must be wrong to do it. And that's where a lot of, like, slut shaming comes from, or, like, all kinds of, like, I know they did some great studies on how, like, a lot of the people who are the most opposed to their children's divorces were people who, like, were in themselves very unhappy marriages but felt like they couldn't.
Sure.
And I guess that's a little bit what I got from the father. Like, not that it's a good thing, but that he thought there was a thing he could never do because he was afraid of it. And so he saw Maribel doing it and wanted to protect her. But then that's why he stands up to the grandmother when she does do it.
Right.
And yeah, I wish we'd gotten more of, I wish I'd seen more of that, not just a toss away line.
Yeah, well, I'm enjoying your perspective on it because I had this sort of frustrated moment with it. Yeah. But I like what you're saying.
I think it's super frustrating.
Yeah.
I think he's still super, like, I hate that he doesn't stand up for her at first,
Yeah, but I like what you're saying about it. It just makes more sense. It puts it in a different context for me.
Yeah. There's so many of these other characters we can go into. I want to do a quick hit on Peppa, the aunt. To me, like, I don't want to say she's supposed to be like sort of like a stand-in for a bipolar character by any means. I mean, that's such a more complicated thing. But it did feel like a lot of times in families, there's one person who is much more emotional than everyone else. And so managing that person's emotions because of how it's going to affect everyone else becomes a thing the whole family's invested in. Her character's barely on screen as much, so I might be stretching here a little bit, but do you think there's a connection there?
Yeah. And I hadn't even really thought about it, but like when they're all sitting at the dinner table when Isabella's almost fiance's family is there,
Mm-hmm.
and they're looking at Peppa.
Peppa, I think is
Peppa.
her pronouns. Yeah.
They're looking at Peppa, and they're like, "Stop it! Like, get it
Yeah.
under control. Stop making it rain. You're embarrassing us." Versus saying to her, she is obviously having a moment. Maybe let's make space for that somewhere.
Right.
Maybe not right here, but somewhere.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
yeah.
everything about like sort of the thing with Bruno and ruining the wedding, is all tied into like he said something that flooded her brain and got her upset. Yeah, and I think you're right. It's that she blames others, but it's because no one in the family makes space for her to have different moods and different perspectives.
Yeah, and that's perhaps another maladaptive subsystem that has been created, and that nobody has space to feel anything,
Mm-hmm.
which is never a good environment for growth.
Yeah. And so her mother, I just like my mother could always heal me with food. I think it's such a beautiful metaphor thing. Luisa and Isabella, though, we've talked about them a lot, but let's go into a little bit more depth with them, especially Luisa, because I love that we get a character who is like, she is the strong one. She's presented as very, butch is the wrong word because she still wears skirts and long hair, but she's the strong one.
Yeah.
What's your take on her presentation and the way her character is written?
I'm all about it. I love any sort of representation or any sort of like idea of subverting gender and playing around with these like traditionally masculine traits of strength and being a rock and all of these things.
The strong silent type.
Strong
very
silent
much
type.
The masculine idea, yeah.
But while also still displaying very stereotypically feminine qualities of wearing dresses, and she did things with her hair, and we find that she is this very deeply feeling person. I was all about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that character, and there's one moment that stood out to me a lot. And I saw a couple other people writing about this as well, so I don't feel like I'm totally, focusing on a wacky thing. But there's a moment early in her song where she is explaining like all the strength that she carries. And she does a kind of like dance move things of like shifting her hips to the left and shifting her hips to the right in a very kind of like feminine dancey thing, but does it to smash the two boulders.
Yeah, right.
And I was like, okay, well, first of all, a whole bunch of like 6 to 10-year-olds just had something imprinted on their emerging attraction and sexuality that they're going to be talking about a lot in 20 years. But also
my
just
God.
like, it was just such a powerful thing of like her, like of it wasn't like the strength and her butchness opposed to her femininity. It was, she gets to be this complex character and she gets to cry.
Yeah.
She cries a lot. She sobs when everything falls apart for her.
Yeah,
I just love that richness to her.
I love that nuance and that complexity. I hadn't noticed that moment where she swings her hips and breaks the rocks, but now I kind of want to go back and watch it because that's awesome.
Yeah, it's like early in the first verse of her song, which you can find the video of.
Yeah. I love the fact that children's sexual awakening will be continued with Disney movies.
How many people was it? The fox from Robin Hood? How many people was it? The mom from The Incredibles? Like, there's just a lot of this. Definitely a thing.
Mine was Meg from Hercules.
Yep, I can see that. I can definitely see that. Awful lot of leg showing in her dance outfits.
So much leg.
And so Isabella, I think we've talked about her a good deal, but I kind of want to just circle back to her. What do you see in her character? Because I think, again, she's portrayed as kind of a junior antagonist to Abuela, but also then gets to have this wonderful, like, breakthrough moment. And her and Mirabelle, like, literally to the point, like they're giving each other a high five as they set up her almost fiance with her sister.
Right.
Which, by the way, maybe a rebound. Like, maybe take a few minutes to pause, but it's Disney. You got to have a happy romance somewhere.
That's the musical moment,
At least she says not so fast when he says, let's get married.
Right.
But yeah, what else you see in Isabella's character we haven't talked about?
I don't know that I've seen anything in particular that we haven't already touched on, other than, to me, she is just such an interesting representation of the caricature of an eldest daughter.
Mm-hmm.
but she brings in her own nuance to it, in that, like, she definitely enjoys the spotlight and
Mm-hmm.
enjoys the attention. And even though she does talk about later, like, I didn't really want this, it it brings in the complexity of, like, I didn't want this, but there are things about it that I enjoyed. So
Right.
yes, there is her own version of surface pressure, and saying, like, I did not ask for these responsibilities, but I like
Right.
the things that I get because I uphold them.
Yeah.
And we see her react when Abuela is disappointed in her, even though Isabella's, like, trying to live her best life. There's a moment of grief of, like, I'm sorry that I'm not living up to your old expectations of me.
Right. She says at one point, I've been stuck being perfect my whole entire life.
Yeah.
And I love the way you say that, because I think it's easy to see, oh, both her and her sisters each have it equally hard because they each think the other one has it better.
Yeah.
And I remember an article that someone who had been a model for a long time wrote about this concept of pretty privilege.
Mm.
And she was saying was, look, I want to be honest, like, the fact that I am this attractive means that people treat me in certain ways that are not good. And I got sucked into this culture of being this beautiful person and being this model and getting all this attention that was incredibly damaging to me. And I want people to know that and understand that, know that this is somewhat like getting swept up in all these pressures that I felt I had to respond to. But I'm never going to claim that what I go through is what happens, like the way people can treat people who are not conventionally attractive,
Right.
or things like that. And to me, I think Isabella's I love the way you put it. That's what made me think of that article of, like, it's not, Isabella does have it better in a lot of ways, certainly than Maribel, maybe than Luisa, but that also doesn't mean that she has it perfect, and
Yeah.
that there is a lot of stress and tension she has to deal with.
Yeah. You're talking about pretty privilege reminds me of that episode of 30 Rock where Liz dates the doctor who's just can't even, like, function in his life because everybody's just been giving him everything he wants because he's attractive. It's the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
I can see that. I can see that. So kind of last thing I want to talk about, just because like the representation in this movie is so important. Representation of different mental illness stuff, the way that the Colombian aspects of it that you and I are going to stay away, or that you and I are not going to dive into. It's not our lanes, but there's such great writing about. I'm going to post a couple more articles on the show notes. But queer representation, I think there's a lot of queer coding in this movie, and I just want to bring it up, not because it's like, oh, hey, look, there's a queer thing, let me tack this on, but because so often family trauma, especially in family silence, is around, someone being a gender or a sexuality that the rest of the family is having trouble accepting or adjusting to. And often it's that, like, we just don't talk. I mean, this is a person I've never met, but my mother told me about how there was a cousin who she really liked growing up, but then no one talked about for 50 years until she found out that he was gay. And that's why he had just been, like, cut out of the family. So that, I think that's the connection with the mental health side of things. What was the queer coding you saw in this movie, and why do you think it's important?
I saw it for Bruno.
Yeah.
Just in exactly what you're talking about, of, like, the family secret. The shameful family secret. And we've talked about that in different aspects, but that is the story of so many queer people.
Mm-hmm.
I think we saw it more overtly for Luisa in some ways, of really playing around with at least, like, binary gender representation.
Right.
If not sexuality so much.
I was thinking that I felt like with both Luisa and Isabella, each of them had something that could easily be read as they are not straight cis. For Luisa, it was that, yeah, she has this much more kind of like, she's the strong one, she's the silent one, she does all the physical strength things. For Isabella, it's the I don't want to marry this man, which a million fanfic writers then took to mean I don't want to marry a man.
Yeah.
Which I think it can be a very good stand-in for. I think if they put those two traits together in the same person, then you'd immediately be like, oh, this is a queer stand-in character, which could be awesome. I kind of love that they separated those two, because I think then, to me, there's room for, I think it's perfectly possible Isabella isn't attracted to guys. And I think it's also perfectly possible she's just not into this one person.
Sure.
I think it's perfectly possible that Luisa is maybe trans on some level. I think it's also perfectly possible that she is very happy being a woman, but a woman who can kick ass.
Sure.
And And yeah, I love that those two. And honestly, I hadn't connected it to Bruno at all. But once you said that, I was like, oh yeah, no, that one especially true is so there.
Yeah, maybe not necessarily. I think his sexuality and his gender is not necessarily the thing that is coded, but his
Right.
story and the way his
Yeah.
family interacts with him, I think would really, really resonate with a lot of queer people.
Yeah. I think it's certainly very true. Very, very true. So I think it's probably a good place for wrapping it up. Again, there's so much more we could talk about. But is there any other kind of last comments or questions or moments in the movie you wanted to bring up?
Really, my only final thought is that I think as a therapist, this is a movie that I'm going to end up bringing up a lot in my sessions. It's going to be this one and Inside Out for me.
Inside Out was also so good.
I
for that
use it
stuff, yeah.
all the time with my clients, and yes, it has flaws, and yes, it's not maybe a perfect representation, but it's such a digestible way to think about family systems.
Yeah.
And I feel very grateful for that, and I feel very grateful that it exists.
Yeah. And I love hearing that because I know I've seen a lot of memes and comments from friends of mine saying, I need my therapist to see this movie because I am Louisa or I am Mirabelle or I am Bruno. And so I feel like, I think it's a great thing when people can say, hey, here's a way to better understand where I'm coming from. I really identify with this song. Let's talk about that. And I just love hearing it from the therapist side as well, that there's a sense of like that it goes both ways.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it can feel like you have this fancy degree. I'm paying you all this money. Why am I talking to you about a Disney movie? But yeah, I think it can. I really love that they say that this movie can help people find themselves and find where they fit in these systems and families and things like that.
That's why art exists to me, so that
Yeah.
you can find yourself in it and understand yourself more.
Yeah. That's a great place to end. So, well, thank you so much. Saren, often this is where I'd say like, hey, promote your own stuff. But I know you're not doing anything at the moment, but you did do a podcast for a while. Is that still available that people can find? And if so, tell us about it.
Oh my gosh, it is still available on YouTube. We didn't make that many episodes, but if you like Disney, and if you like Marvel, and if you like Parks and Rec, then it would be the thing for you. It's called the TLDR podcast. We're the one with the yellow logo, like the yellow and blue logo. So if you like nerdy stuff.
Nice. So it's the TLDR as if the too long didn't read?
Yes.
Awesome. And I'll post a link to that also in the show notes so that people can find that on wherever you post podcasts.
Okay,
well,
sweet.
Saren, thank you so much. This was so much fun. To our listeners, I'm sure there's so much here we unpacked. I would love to hear from you. What did you love about the movie? What didn't you love? What's the character or the song that you identified with? What's the thing that we maybe missed or didn't talk about here? Particularly, Sarah and I are both coming from white American contexts. There's a lot of other ways to see this movie. I'd love if folks out there are coming to this from a Colombian perspective or a Latinx perspective or really just any other background or culture and see it differently. Love to hear those thoughts too. If you go to theethicalpanda.com, there you'll find all our contact information, Facebook, Twitter. You can also email us directly if you don't want to say anything in public. Email us at theethicalpanda@gmail.com or Matthew@theethicalpanda.com. Either one of those will work. Of course, please check out my other podcasts. On the Star Wars Universe podcast, we're doing episode by episode coverage of the Book of Boba Fett, which has been coming out. We're having a lot of fun with that. A lot of other great things are going to be coming on this. We will finally get to those last 2 episodes of The Witcher, I promise. A lot of things happen around the holidays and people getting sick and stuff like that, but we haven't forgotten. Check out all that. Check out all the great content on the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. And most importantly, have a great day.